Oh, yes, this is the signal. All right. Hi, and welcome to our lecture for the Mirror Stage Off Night Community Forums. I'm your host, Megan, and I'm the production manager of Mirror Stage. We are here at 12th Ave Arts on Capitol Hill, and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. We recognize that we are on the Duwamish territory and honor their elders past, present, and emerging. This evening, we are joined by the Washington Racial Restrictive Covenants Project to share on the history and legacy of racial restrictions in Seattle real estate. We are excited to share with you a deeper dive into some of the themes from our main stage production, The Squirrel Plays, which is having its closing week on this stage tomorrow through Saturday. Please welcome the Washington Racial Restrictive Covenants Project as they introduce themselves.
All right, hello everybody. I'm watching from home. My name is Sam Cutts, and I am a research associate with the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project over at UW. I'm currently a senior, graduating in like 3 weeks, which is really exciting, with the Bachelor's of Arts in History and International Studies.
Hi, I'm Colton Shans. I'm a research associate with the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project, and I'm a UW sophomore majoring in history.
And I'm David Cunningham. I've just recently joined the Covenants Project. I'm a freshman and I'm going for accounting.
All right, and before we move on to our presentation, we do want to address that we have a content warning. Given that our project deals with a lot of primary documents and historical records, some of the language is used is offensive and racist, and in the handout and in what we're saying, you might see or hear offensive language that was used in this context. And so to start us off today, Colton is going to talk about racial restrictive covenants, what they are, what this project is all about, and redlining before handing it off to David, who will walk us through the local history of segregation and examples of restrictive covenants. We'll discuss the end of racial restrictive I'll discuss the end of racial restrictive covenants, and then we will all conclude by talking about the legacy.
So, racial restrictive covenants are agreements entered into by a group of property owners or a seller in a given neighborhood which legally binded them to not sell, lease, or rent their property to specified racial or religious groups. These were legally binding clauses in deeds and other property records. I have also written this out on the handout that all of you have. And they're also available on the Seattle Restrictive Covenants Project website. These are all examples of restrictive covenants, and each of them were taken from property records in King County. But we're going to go into depth later about some of the language but these were extremely explicit covenants that explicitly denied a property to a racial group. So we are the Restrictive Racial Covenants Project. This project began in 2005, but was unable to be completed because there was not enough funding. However, in March 2021, the state legislature passed and signed SHB 1335 to fund this project, and we have been tasked with identifying racist deed restrictions and covenants in property records in counties across the entire state of Washington. To date, we have identified about 35,000 properties in King County, 4,000 in Pierce and Snohomish, and with work in Thurston and a variety of other counties. If you look at the handout with the maps on the left side are the ones produced by the project. The red circles on the map indicate the restrictions we have found thus far in deeds, and the yellow indicate restrictions advertised in newspapers. It was common for subdivisions to be advertised as restricted as code for white only, and we have not yet found the property records. The advertisements for Blue Ridge and Innis Arden can be seen on your handout. Recently, we have started to map individual parcels as seen in the map seen on the right with the smaller red dots. Parcels are the individual pieces of land that were restricted. We have maps for many other counties in Western Washington on our website. Look up Racial Restrictive Covenants Project to find it, and it'll be on the website linked to UW. This map really shows the geography of where restrictions and restrictive covenants were used. It partly reflects the timing of development. Areas that were newly subdivided between 1926 and 1952 were the most likely to be restricted in their deeds because it was easy for developers to put restrictions on new subdivisions rather than already existing ones. These restrictions would then apply to all properties and all future owners in perpetuity. With that being said, though, these maps are incomplete, our research is still ongoing, and many areas that appear to be unrestricted actually may have been, or they may not have had restrictions but were actually segregated by other means. The real estate industry directly contributed to segregation and was responsible for these racial restrictive covenants. Until 1950, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had a clause in their code of ethics against selling homes to a person of color because it would be destructive to the property values of the neighborhood. Most banks, loan companies, title companies, insurance companies, and real estate men were closely affiliated with the real estate board and upheld their code of ethics. Almost all of the Seattle real estate men were members of the National Association and upheld their code of ethics here. Many people confuse racial restrictive covenants and redlining, but they are not the same thing. However, it is important to note how vital the federal government was in instrumenting segregation. During the New Deal era, which paralleled the era of private restriction, the federal government started several different racially restrictive housing efforts, including racialized public housing, the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the Federal Housing Administration. Millions had lost homes in the Great Depression, and the housing industry had collapsed, along with the lending industry. First with the Homeowners Loan Corporation and then with the FHA, the federal government rescued homeowners by providing new mortgages to existing homeowners and encouraging new lending on long-term mortgages backed by FHA insurance. These measures, over time, turned the U.S. into a homeowners nation, or rather a nation where most white families owned homes. The famous redlining maps are part of this. HOLC produced them in 1936 in order to advise mortgage lenders where their investments would be safe and where they would not be. You can see one for Seattle on your handout. Hazardous neighborhoods were coded red, declining neighborhoods in yellow. Any neighborhood where Black or Asian people lived was red. FHA followed up by refusing to underwrite mortgages in such neighborhoods and typically denying insurance to families of color. Beginning in the 1920s and continuing through the next 3 decades, the real estate industry's efforts paralleled that of the federal government by implementing things like racially restrictive covenants and housing discrimination to further solidify segregation. If you look at our maps and the redlining maps, you can see that they follow similar patterns. While both of these practices led to segregation, the big distinction here is that redlining was a practice of the federal government, while racial restrictive covenants were a product of the real estate industry but enabled by the federal government. And now I'm going to hand it off to David, who's going to talk about Seattle's history of racial exclusion.
Yeah, so now I'm going to transition to focusing on racial segregation in King County and Seattle. Seattle has a long history of racial segregation and discrimination. For many generations, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans were shut out of neighborhoods, schools, many occupations, and sometimes stores and restaurants. Seattle and King County still show the effects of that history. In the late 1800s, indigenous Americans were banned from the city of Seattle, despite the fact that Seattle is located on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Chinese people were also driven out of Seattle in 1886, and those that returned were expected to live in Chinatown or to work as servants in the homes of wealthy whites. For a large portion of the 20th century, non-white people in Seattle were concentrated in the central district south of Capitol Hill. King County was heavily segregated, and very few people of color lived outside of that area. Although many assumed that the Pacific Northwest was immune to segregation like that of the Jim Crow South, it is important to acknowledge that the PNW practiced active racial discrimination for a very long time. In most southern states, segregation of schools, buses, restaurants, and public facilities were required by law. Although this was not the case in Washington state, local government agencies did in fact support discrimination and segregation in various ways, including the certification of racial restrictive covenants and encouraging police to harass Black individuals seen in white neighborhoods. And Seattle's segregation practices extended beyond housing. Black and Asian Americans were often denied service in bars, restaurants, barbershops, and even hospitals. It is important that we stray away from this narrative that overt forms of racism were just a thing of the South, because as we have mentioned, white people in the PNW practiced very active and explicit racial discrimination as well. Given Seattle's restrictive history, racial restrictive covenants were put into place by many sellers and within many neighborhoods. An example of a prominent Seattle resident that often bought and restricted subdivisions is William Boeing, the founder of Boeing Aircraft. He and his wife Bertha purchased large tracts of land in what is now Northwest Seattle and Shoreline. Innis Arden, which you can see the advertisement for on your handout, was one of their subdivisions. All of their subdivisions were restricted to only people that were white or Caucasian. In just 4 subdivisions alone, the Boeings restricted a total of 960 properties to white people only. It was more complicated to impose restrictions on older neighborhoods. As a result of this, sometimes neighborhood associations organized petition campaigns to convince fellow residents to bind their property with a racial covenant. One of the best documented efforts of this restricted most blocks in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. Starting in 1927, the Capitol Hill Community Club organized a 3-year campaign during which 964 property owners signed petition covenants restricting 183 blocks and ultimately 958 lots of property from black people. All right, so now we're going to look at some restrictions that we found from properties in King County that contain some interesting language. The restriction for Lake Washington Garden Tracts, which is on the east side near Bellevue, stated that the property could not be sold, leased, or occupied by any not of the Aryan race. If this language sounds familiar, it's because it's the same language used by Hitler, which makes the timing of this restriction especially interesting because World War II and all of Hitler's atrocities had already ended and been unearthed and publicized at this point. Ladd's second edition and Jefferson Park, located in Seattle, stated that only white people could live there except in the circumstance of a domestic servant living in the home of their master. This one's interesting because it has clear slavery connotations in its language, even in 1927, illustrating the white perspective of non-whites as subservient long after the official banning of slavery. Sheridan Heights in Lake Forest Park stated that the property shall not be sold to anyone of any Asiatic, Negro, Hawaiian, or Malay race. Lastly, McMicken Heights, number 2 in SeaTac, stated that no part of the property was to ever be used or occupied by anyone that was Hebrew, Ethiopian, Malay, or of the Asiatic race. And this all just goes to show the extent to which people of color and Jewish people were restricted from many properties in King County, and also shows the extent to which white people covered all their bases to make clear that if you were not white, you were not welcome in many neighborhoods and parts of King County. You can see more examples of racial terms in the examples on your handout, and now I'm going to hand it to Sam, who's going to talk about enforcing segregation.
All right, so even though the use of restrictive covenants was prevalent, they were unfortunately not the most powerful tool of segregation, and the fact that we have found few or none in some neighborhoods can mean very little. Social means, violence, harassment, and the actions of realtors were the large forces in keeping certain racial and religious groups of people out of certain areas. This social enforcement was often handled by real estate agents who blocked access to home ownership, and by angry white neighbors and community members who harassed and threatened. And if that failed, real violence followed. So an instance of this is the bombing of the home of Carl Brooks and his family in Shoreline. After Carl Brooks, who was a civil rights activist, and his family moved into the restricted neighborhood of Lago Vista, their family was harassed, and after harassment did not cause the Brooks family to leave, race terrorists threw a dynamite bomb into their home, shattering windows and endangering the lives of their 2 sleeping children. This act of terror was not even reported in the major daily newspapers at the time, but only reported in a left-wing weekly newspaper. The fact that this explicit act of racially motivated terror was ignored by the major media of the time indicates the pervasive and unanimous consensus of segregation among institutions of power. According to the article in this left-wing newspaper, the sheriff's office actually at the time condoned the campaign of intimidation that preceded the dynamite throwing. This is a prime example of a sundown zone or sundown town law enforcement. Until the late 1960s, Seattle and other police forces in King County and other counties in Washington state enforced informal sundown rules and zones. In the evenings, after work, African Americans were not permitted to be in white neighborhoods, and they would often be stopped, questioned, and harassed if they were seen in one. These sundown zones highlight the social enforcement that accompanied or acted as a substitute for the use of racial restrictive covenants to ensure the segregation of King County and demonstrate how practices of social enforcement were often allowed to continue and often supported by those in power. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the end of restrictive covenants. So in 1948, in the landmark Shelley v. Kramer Supreme Court case, the court ruled that restrictive covenants in property deeds violated the equal protection provision of the 14th Amendment. However, it did not become legally enforceable, and the misconception that it changed everything is not true. The ruling actually did very little. New restrictions were added to subdivisions and recorded by county auditors well into the 1950s in King County, and as before, segregation was enforced by other means. And recently, we have actually found restrictions into the 1960s in Snohomish and Pierce County, which is pretty late when you consider when the Supreme Court case was made in 1948. So in 1968, after 40 cities had already passed laws banning discrimination in housing, Seattle citizens voted against the measure 2-1, actively going against housing desegregation. And many of the real estate industry put many ads in the newspaper at the time, claiming that the proposed law violated property rights. And it's important to note that this decision was made in the midst of a nationwide struggle for civil rights. Things didn't really change until the Fair Housing Act in 1968, following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, and since then, discrimination has been prohibited. And then the legislature followed up in 1969, voided discriminatory provisions in real estate contracts. But just to emphasize how little changed in those 20 years after that Shelley v. Kramer case in 1948, here is an incident of housing terror that took place in the area near the University of Washington in 1958. Marion West, who was white, was able to buy a small rooming house with her husband Ray, who was black. They rented rooms to students of color who otherwise found it hard to find housing. But after years of harassment, including a cross burning on their lawn, they gave up and moved away. So now I'm going to hand it to Colton, who's going to been talking about the legacy and aftermath of these restrictions.
Thank you, Sam. So after residential distribution, there was a slow end to segregation after 1968. It's not as if everyone moved into the previously segregated neighborhoods. The process of desegregation has been very slow in King County, and there was not any progress until the 1980s. Even then, the process has been different for different groups. Currently, the Asian and Asian American population in King County lives in nearly every part of the county. I don't have time to explain them all, but there are multiple factors that work for changing residential patterns. Large waves of immigration have tripled and quadrupled the Asian and Asian American population in King County, contributing to a wider spread of residential patterns. On the other hand, the African American population has grown slowly. While Asian Americans live all over the county, the majority of the Black Americans in Seattle are moving south rather than north, east, or west. This is due to the large increase in the cost of living in Seattle. North Seattle still remains 75% white, and 58% of Black or white families would have to move to achieve full integration. If you're curious and want to look more into changing residential distributions, we have maps decade by decade on our website. So this history largely matters because of the wealth effect of yesterday's segregation. Homeownership is the main way that Americans build family wealth. Segregation suppressed homeownership and wealth building opportunities for people of color who had trouble buying homes, and those who did manage to buy homes usually paid artificially high prices. The graph on the handout shows the homeownership rates for Black and white families in Washington using census data. Even though racial restrictive covenants and housing discrimination are now technically illegal, Black families still are less likely to own homes, and their homes are worth less on average than white families who have been accumulating real estate wealth for generations. Across income levels, today's white families are twice as likely to own a home as Black families in Washington. Black homeownership rates are lower than white rates at all income levels, especially among families earning less than $75,000. Nearly 47% of white residents of Washington who make less than $50,000 a year are homeowners. If you consider the rising cost of homes, this illustrates how multi-generational wealth building through homeownership has worked. People who were not able to buy homes historically have missed a huge opportunity to build wealth. And we should also note that homeownership rates have declined dramatically for Black families, especially for incomes under $75,000. 10 years ago, 52% of Black families in that income category owned a home. That dropped to 30% in the recent census. White rates have also declined. This no doubt reflects the huge increase in home prices that we have been seeing recently. Now I'm going to hand it over to David, who's going to talk about the legacy of housing segregation in education.
All right, yeah. So we're going to talk about education. In 1957, following the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision, the Seattle School Board held their first census by race and found that just 5% of its 91,782 students were Black. But of those 5%, 81% were concentrated in just 9 of 115 schools in Seattle. At this time, 6 of the 9 high schools in Seattle had less than 5 Black students. In 1962, Garfield High School, located in the Central District, became the first predominantly Black high school in the state with a 51% Black enrollment. If we think back to the redlining map created by the HOLC, schools like Franklin High School and Rainier Beach were in areas that the HOLC deemed definitely declining, while Chief South and Garfield were in the hazardous area. To this day, the schools in areas that were redlined or segregated still disproportionately serve students of color. Schools in previously redlined neighborhoods are less likely to receive substantial amounts of PTA money. The Seattle high schools that receive the smallest amount of PTA money predominantly serve students of color, while the high schools that receive the most PTA money predominantly serve white students. In an era where our schools are so underfunded, PTA money buys extra staff, technology, course material, tutoring, and funds extracurriculars, as well as new uniforms for sports and support for college preparation. PTA money is just one of the many ways the legacy of segregation and housing discrimination continue to impact education and many other facets of life. We also see the impacts of residential segregation in public health. Research shows that life expectancy is lower for redline communities. There are higher rates of poverty, diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, and pulmonary disease. In Seattle specifically, redline neighborhoods have the most infant deaths per year, lowest life expectancy, and highest rates of low birth weight infants. Historically, redline areas consistently have higher levels of air pollution than areas that were deemed desirable or best by the HOLC. People who live in these historically redline areas also deal with environmental hazards like higher temperatures and less access to green spaces, which has a negative impact on their health and overall well-being.
All right, and with all of this discussion of legacy, you might ask if there's anything being done right now to address this, and the answer is yes. So House Bill 1474, signed by the governor last Monday, acknowledges state responsibility for generations of harm resulting from government actions in support of racist property restrictions. It establishes a covenant homeownerships account to provide down payment loans to first-time homebuyers with incomes below the area median average who were victims of property exclusion before 1968, and it also includes their descendants. And to give you an idea, for a family of 3 in King County, the area median average income is $107,000 a year. And we're at the project really excited about this bill because it's really seeking to address the legacy of covenants in a concrete way with physical and very palpable effects, with hopefully increasing homeownership among these groups, and counteract the very real and long-lasting effects of this practice. It's the first of its kind in the U.S., and it's a really important step to acknowledging the practice of racial restrictive covenants, not only in Washington state, but the rest of the U.S. And additionally, there is also the ability, if you find that you're doing some investigation into your home, when you find that there is a restrictive covenant on your deed, King County and I think a few other counties in Washington have something called a covenant modification form, which you can find on the King County website if you search that up, covenant modification form King County in Google. And it basically it's a way that it's acknowledging that you have a restriction in your housing deed in its history, and it's a little piece, it's like an amendment that is on your deed that acknowledges that it has a restrictive covenant and that the government is aware of it, and really denouncing this practice. But at the project, we really want to keep these restrictions to be known. We don't want to erase them from history, so we don't want to remove them from deeds, but we want to acknowledge them because it's really important to keep the history alive, because it's very easy, if the language is not actually there, to deny that these practices happened and not be able to really hold the government accountable for these actions, such as being done, thankfully, with that House Bill 1474. And then additionally, if you guys are interested in this and really want to get involved, we do have a few volunteer opportunities. So currently our main volunteer opportunity is through an online platform called Zooniverse, which is a great way. It's a site that has a bunch of different research projects that really want to get community involved. Our page should be linked on our website under Zooniverse or Zooniverse Racial Restrictive Covenants, and it should also come up. And this is basically, you guys will be going through the deeds and documents that we look at as researchers, helping us find racial restrictive covenants in language. Because luckily we do have our programmer on the team who is able, with digitized records, to go through OCR, these hundreds of thousands in some cases, but mainly tens of thousands of records from all the various counties in Western Washington, and luckily put them through a program and spit out all of these documents that have racially charged language, but sometimes there are false positives, and so we require assistance to go through and find these deeds. And you guys would be contributing to the maps that you either can see on our website or you saw on the PDF. But it's a really great way to get involved with real research and really look at primary sources. Wait, I have one more thing. All right, and then just a few key takeaways to kind of like wrap up the presentation. So racial restrictive covenants are distinct from redlining, but both are tools of segregation. Racial restrictive covenants refer to contract language in deeds that states that no person of certain racial groups can live or occupy a certain property. Redlining refers to maps created by the federal program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to advise mortgage lenders where their investments would be safe and where they would not be, resulting in mortgages giving out primarily to white individuals in white neighborhoods and not being given out to people of color in non-white neighborhoods, or being given out to people who often bought properties worth a lot less money. King County has a prevalent history of segregation and exclusion, and this is something that the Pacific Northwest residents down in Oregon as well and other states need to confront and reckon with. Covenants were used widely in King County and other cities and counties in Washington, but were not the only means of enforcing segregation. Social enforcement played a large role in keeping non-white people out of certain neighborhoods. And the legacy of racial restrictive covenants and other means of housing segregation still impact our communities, as we discussed in regards to wealth accumulation with homeownership, education, and public health. And lastly, if you want to get involved in the project, check out that site, Zooniverse. It's a really good way to get involved. Thank you.
I don't know if you heard that large thump every time I get out of the chairs. Oh, man. Well, I want to thank you all so much for being here and educating us today. I had not realized the extent of the language involved in a lot of this history, so that was really important to be made aware of. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. I've got a couple questions for you. I know you talked a bit about it, but do you want to expand any more on possibly what some common misconceptions might be about racial restrictions in housing here in Seattle? Yeah? Okay.
Do you guys want to talk, or I can also do it? I think the biggest one is the misconception of just equating redlining with racial restrictive covenants, which we did talk about in the presentation. And racial restrictive covenants were a lot more on an individual, I'd say a lot more local basis, I'd say. That was individual people making the decision to restrict either entire neighborhoods or a few pieces of property. Some other ones I think is, I think a very common narrative among many people, I know this is what I learned when I was in school, like in history, is that segregation was a really big problem in the South, Jim Crow and everything prior to the Civil Rights Movement and continuing on afterwards. But realizing that the entire country still has to reckon with these issues, and it was very active, even if it wasn't codified in actual legal documents, like to the extent that it was in the South, even though racial restrictive covenants is codifying segregation in legal documents. So just really acknowledging that the Pacific Northwest and other places in what was the north of the country practiced active and explicit forms of racial discrimination. I think are probably the two biggest misconceptions. Do you guys have anything to add? It's okay if you don't. Okay.
Well, this is something I'm curious about, but what are some of your goals and plans moving forward?
Our goals right now involve creating and strengthening and expanding our current mapping project of the scope and extent of these racial restrictive covenants within all of the counties of Washington. And we actually are working jointly to a team at Eastern Washington University, which I've also worked with in my hometown of Spokane, that is doing this work in the eastern counties of Washington. And together we will have a combined database and map of these documents in Washington State.
We're also working on community outreach quite a bit, especially with the bill that's been passed, because we just need to educate the public of what benefits they may have and what things they could do to help other people. Because so much of what the bill can do for people has to be done by us.
And then hopefully, once we get those maps up, we've kind of completed all of the research, although we don't know how long it's going to take. There are so many undigitized documents we have to go through, especially in King County, but With that, the bill that provides our funding, the State House Bill 1335, the state legislature also mandated that us as a project, that we're supposed to inform homeowners if their property has a racial restrictive covenant. Like in the past, it was put on their property. And because we're still gathering so much data, we don't know how we're going to do that yet. But eventually, hopefully, we can get the word out to the individual homeowners whose specific properties are affected.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing, and I wish you all luck in the future with these. My final question, which you did already talk about, so if you have nothing to add, is just is there anything else you can share with us about how to get involved or supporting the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project as you move forward? Or is that still something that, as these projects come up, you'll potentially have more roles and information about?
So besides Zooniverse, we do have a few other things that we do. We have a newsletter, which I think you can sign up for on our website, Racial Restrictive Covenants. It's on a UW page, which every month we send that out, and it will have some updates around the project. And if any volunteer opportunities change, we'll also put that in the newsletter, as well as just any news we think is important. Additionally, I do a lot of work with volunteers, and currently right now we're having volunteers in-person work at the UW library, going through microfilm with all of these, thousands of deeds composed in this microfilm. And they're also doing research that, just due to some transitions in the project and the end of the school year, I don't know if that's going to continue through the summer, but if that's something you would be interested in, feel free to email us. It's WACovenants, all lowercase, one word, @gmail.com if you'd be interested, and I can put you on the email list for if we're going to start that up again in June.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for being here. We learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming out here and discussing more about the themes that are important to our show and important to the history of Seattle. And thank you all for being here with us tonight on our live stream. If you are viewing this before May 20th, there is still time to see the squirrel plays. You can learn more on our website at mirrorstage.org. Have a great evening, and thank you for joining us.